Most Canadians view their boycotts on U.S. goods and travel as temporary, but nearly half say they will outlast the Trump White House.
8 months without American produce in Alberta supermarkets is not a consumer trend. It is a warning that the United States is losing export markets without realizing it, and that the rules of the global trade war have quietly changed. For decades, agricultural trade between the United States and Canada was treated as untouchable. Fruits and vegetables crossed the border daily, integrated so deeply into Canadian supply chains that disruption was considered unthinkable. That assumption is now demonstrably false. No tariffs were announced, no sanctions were imposed, no government statement signaled a breakdown. Yet across Alberta, one of Canada's most trade-dependent provinces, American produce has largely vanished from shelves. Not temporarily, not sporadically, consistently, for 8 consecutive months. This did not happen because of price or quality. It happened because political tension eroded trust, and once trust collapsed, market behavior followed. Consumers disengaged, retailers recalculated exposure, procurement managers quietly rewrote supplier contracts. Alternative supply chains were locked in before Washington understood there was a problem. From a policy standpoint, nothing appears broken. Trade statistics show no formal blockage. Diplomatic channels remain open. But economically, the outcome is severe. A major export market has functionally closed without triggering negotiations, countermeasures, or relief mechanisms. This is what makes the situation dangerous. In a modern trade war, markets no longer wait for tariffs. They move preemptively, silently, and permanently when political risk crosses an invisible threshold. And by the end of this report, we will expose the specific procurement shift that explains why this loss may already be irreversible and why American agriculture may be far more exposed than official data currently suggests. When Alberta buyers stopped placing orders, there was no immediate alarm. Procurement managers did not issue public explanations. Trucks were not turned back at the border. Instead, contracts were quietly reduced, delayed, or allowed to expire. Replacement sourcing was secured from Mexico, Chile, Peru, and expanded domestic greenhouse production within Canada. Within weeks, new logistics routes were operational. Within months, American suppliers were no longer essential. For farmers in the United States, the consequences surfaced downstream. Fruits and vegetables are highly perishable. When export demand weakens, excess supply is pushed back into domestic markets almost immediately. Industry data shows that even a small percentage drop in export absorption can translate into disproportionate price pressure at the farm gate. In several produce categories, wholesale prices declined while storage costs rose, squeezing margins that were already under stress from higher fertilizer, fuel, and labor expenses. What makes this breakdown particularly dangerous is its invisibility within official trade frameworks. There is no tariff increase to negotiate, no retaliatory measure to repeal, no policy trigger for emergency support. From a regulatory standpoint, trade between the United States and Canada remains open, yet functionally, for many exporters, access to shelf space in Alberta has already been lost. In the context of the broader trade war, this represents a structural escalation. Markets are no longer waiting for governments to act. They are pricing political risk directly into sourcing decisions. Once alternative suppliers prove reliable, loyalty to previous partners weakens rapidly. After 8 months, American produce is no longer viewed as the default option in Alberta. It is perceived as a variable risk, and this is the critical point Washington may be underestimating. Once supply chains are rebuilt around new partners, reversing that shift requires more than improved rhetoric. It requires price concessions, long-term guarantees, and often years of rebuilding trust. And ahead, there is one procurement decision rarely discussed outside retail boardrooms that explains why this silent breakdown may soon extend beyond Alberta, and why the United States could be facing a far broader agricultural exposure than current export figures reveal. In recent years, Canada has ranked as the single largest foreign destination for United States agricultural exports. Annual farm and food shipments to Canada have exceeded 30 billion United States dollars, with fresh fruits and vegetables accounting for several billions of that total. In certain produce categories, Canada absorbs between 1/10 and 1/5 of total United States export volume. As one of Canada's fastest growing provinces by population and food demand, Alberta has historically imported large volumes of United States produce due to geographic proximity and integrated logistics. When procurement orders from Alberta retailers declined over an 8-month period, the impact was not isolated. It immediately reduced aggregate export absorption. For produce farmers, even a decline of 5% in export demand can trigger severe price pressure. Industry pricing models show that when surplus volume is redirected into domestic markets, wholesale prices can fall by double-digit percentages within weeks. This effect is magnified for perishable goods, where storage capacity is limited and timing is critical. Farmers who expanded acreage based on historical Canadian demand now face excess supply with no comparable alternative outlet. Financing obligations remain fixed. Input costs for fertilizer, fuel, and transportation remain elevated compared to pre-pandemic levels. Labor shortages continue to constrain operations. The loss of a stable export buyer does not merely reduce revenue, it destabilizes entire production plans. What is most damaging is that this shock arrives after capital has already been committed. Planting decisions are locked in months earlier. Equipment leases and operating loans are already in place. By the time export demand weakens visibly, losses are unavoidable. Yet from a policy perspective, none of this qualifies as a trade disruption. There is no tariff to suspend, no sanction to negotiate, and no mechanism to trigger emergency support. On the Canadian side, the numbers tell a different story. Retailers in Alberta replaced United States produced suppliers rapidly, sourcing increased volumes from Mexico, Chile, Peru, and expanding domestic greenhouse operations. Canada has invested billions of dollars over the past decade in controlled environment agriculture, allowing year-round production of items once sourced primarily from the United States. Within months, new supply contracts were in place. Distribution routes were adjusted. Inventory systems stabilized. From the consumer's perspective, shelves remained stocked and disruption was limited. This is the structural danger for United States exporters. Retail procurement decisions are typically locked in on multi-year cycles. Once suppliers are vetted, logistics are optimized, and consumer acceptance is confirmed, there is little incentive to reverse course. Even if political tensions ease, procurement managers prioritize predictability and reputational safety over historical relationships. Re-entry into a lost retail market is costly. Exporters must offer lower prices, longer contracts, and stronger guarantees to displace suppliers who are already performing adequately. In some cases, retailers will not reconsider at all if alternative sourcing meets baseline expectations. What Alberta demonstrates is not a temporary protest, but a reconfiguration of trade flows. When consumer sentiment aligns with procurement strategy, the resulting shift can outlast the political moment that triggered it. For Washington, this creates a critical blind spot. Official trade data may lag real-world exposure by months or even years. Export markets can disappear quietly, while aggregate statistics still appear stable. And next, we will examine why this form of market loss is far more difficult to reverse than any tariff dispute, and why the United States may already be underestimating how deeply this new phase of the trade war is reshaping its agricultural future. From the perspective of Washington, the situation in Alberta does not yet register as a crisis. There are no new tariffs recorded in official filings. Cross-border trade statistics still show agricultural flows between the United States and Canada continuing at large aggregate levels. On paper, Canada remains the largest export destination for United States farm and food products, with annual shipments still measured in the tens of billions of dollars. This is precisely the blind spot. Aggregate data mass structural shifts occurring inside individual product categories and regional supply chains. A loss of shelf space in Alberta does not immediately collapse national export totals, but it removes a layer of demand that many producers quietly rely on to balance thin margins. When that layer disappears, the stress surfaces elsewhere in lower farm gate prices, higher inventories, and increased reliance on domestic buyers who cannot absorb surplus indefinitely. Historically, Washington has treated Canada as a politically stable, low-risk market. That assumption has shaped export strategies, credit decisions, and farm expansion plans for decades. In effect, Canada functioned as an extension of the domestic market for many producers. What Alberta reveals is that this assumption no longer holds. Because the disengagement is consumer-driven and retailer-executed, there is no diplomatic lever to pull. No negotiation forum exists to restore trust at the checkout aisle. By the time policymakers recognize the exposure, procurement contracts have already rolled over into new cycles. In this phase of the trade war, waiting for tariffs to signal danger may mean reacting months or years too late. While Washington remains focused on policy indicators, Canada's retail and supply chain actors are already operating in a different strategic framework. Canada has spent more than a decade investing heavily in supply diversification. Imports of fresh produce from Mexico and South America have increased steadily, while domestic greenhouse output has expanded significantly through public and private investment. In recent years, controlled environment agriculture projects worth several billions of Canadian dollars have come online specifically to reduce dependence on single foreign suppliers. Alberta's response fits neatly into this long-term trajectory. By replacing United States suppliers with alternatives that meet baseline cost and reliability requirements, retailers reduce exposure not only to political friction, but to future trade volatility. From their standpoint, the transition has been validated by consumer acceptance and operational stability. International suppliers are watching closely. For exporters in Mexico, Chile, and Peru, the Alberta shift is not viewed as a temporary opportunity, but as evidence that North American trade patterns are becoming more fluid. Market access is no longer guaranteed by proximity or history. It must be continuously earned through political neutrality and reputational stability. This is the strategic recalibration Washington has yet to fully confront. If Canada can disengage quietly at the retail level, other partners may follow similar paths under different circumstances. The risk is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of assumed markets, one procurement cycle at a time. And next, we arrive at the most uncomfortable question of all. Whether this consumer-led disengagement represents a temporary correction or the beginning of a long-term structural decline in United States agricultural influence that tariffs and trade talks alone can no longer fix. What is unfolding in Alberta is not dangerous because of its size alone, it is dangerous because of what it signals. Canada represents one of the most predictable and integrated export markets the United States has ever had. For decades, its proximity, regulatory alignment, and political stability allowed American exporters to treat Canadian demand as an extension of domestic consumption. That assumption underpinned long-term planting decisions, infrastructure investment, and farm credit models across multiple states. When a market like that disengages quietly, it exposes a structural vulnerability. United States agriculture is highly export dependent. In recent years, roughly 1/5 of total farm income has been tied directly or indirectly to foreign demand. Fruits and vegetables are among the most exposed segments because they rely on consistent, high-frequency cross-border movement and have limited storage flexibility. If consumer-driven disengagement can take hold in Canada without tariffs or sanctions, the same mechanism can operate elsewhere. Markets do not need to announce their exit. They simply adjust sourcing behavior when political risk rises above an acceptable threshold. This is the broader implication for the trade war. The traditional playbook assumes that market access is lost through formal policy conflict. But what Alberta demonstrates is that access can erode through perception alone. When that happens, exporters receive no warning, no negotiation window, and no adjustment period. The danger is not sudden collapse, it is cumulative loss. Each procurement cycle that renews without United States suppliers locks in displacement. Each season that passes without shelf presence makes re-entry harder. Over time, what begins as a regional adjustment becomes a national exposure. Reversing this type of loss is possible, but it is far more complex than resolving a tariff dispute. Retail buyers operate on multi-year horizons. Once alternative suppliers prove reliable, the incentive to return to previous partners weakens significantly. To regain shelf space, United States exporters would need to offer not only competitive pricing, but extended contracts, stronger guarantees, and assurances that political volatility will not translate into reputational risk. Even then, success is not assured. From the Canadian side, Diversification is no longer a defensive move. It is now a validated strategy. Consumers have adapted. Supply chains are functioning. The perceived cost of excluding United States produce has declined. For Washington, this creates a strategic dilemma. Diplomatic engagement alone may not be sufficient. Market confidence must be rebuilt at the consumer level, the retailer level, and the logistics level simultaneously. That process takes years, not months. And during that time, American farmers continue operating under pressure from rising costs, labor constraints, and climate uncertainty. This is why Alberta matters far beyond its borders. It illustrates how quickly an assumed market can disappear, how slowly it can return, and how little control policymakers may have once consumer sentiment and procurement strategy align. And in the final part of this report, we will confront the central question, in this case, forces onto the table. Whether the United States is prepared for a trade war where markets close silently, and whether this moment marks a temporary setback or a lasting shift in global agricultural power. What has unfolded in Alberta over the past 8 months is not an isolated retail anomaly. It is a signal. A market that once absorbed billions of dollars in United States agricultural output has partially disengaged without tariffs, without sanctions, and without a single formal policy announcement. From the outside, trade relations appear intact. From the inside, a layer of demand has already been removed. This is the most uncomfortable reality for Washington. In a traditional trade war, damage is visible. Tariffs rise, exports fall, negotiations follow. But this case bypasses the entire policy framework. Consumer sentiment shifted first. Retail procurement followed. Supply chains adapted. By the time export data begins to reflect the change, the underlying decisions are already locked in. For American farmers, the consequences are tangible. Lost shelf space means excess supply, lower farm gate prices, and higher financial stress in an industry where margins are thin and timing is unforgiving. For rural economies, it means pressure on employment, logistics, and long-term viability. For Canada, the lesson is different. Diversification works. Consumer behavior can reinforce national resilience. Supply chains that reduce political risk can stabilize markets even during geopolitical tension. The broader implication reaches beyond agriculture. If markets can disengage silently at the consumer and retail level, then proximity, history, and alignment are no longer sufficient to guarantee access. In this phase of the trade war, reputation matters as much as policy. Trust matters as much as price. The United States is not losing because of inferior products or higher costs. It is losing because market confidence, once shaken, does not wait for diplomacy to catch up. The question now is not whether Alberta will return to American produce in the short term. The question is whether similar disengagements are already forming elsewhere, unnoticed, inside procurement systems that do not make headlines. Is this a bold recalibration of global trade by consumers, or a risky mistake that leaves the United States increasingly exposed in a trade war it no longer fully controls? Subscribe for more fact-based global trade analysis.